Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Italian olive oil cake. That's right, we're going to make cake with olive oil instead of butter, which might sound a little bit strange, but it works. It works really, really well. And unlike its fussier French cousin, this requires very little effort and almost no finesse or technique. Right, we're not sifting or creaming or separating or folding. Okay, all we're doing here is basically mixing up everything in a bowl, and it's ready to bake. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by making sure we have a cake pan prepped, which means we've cut out a piece of parchment paper for the bottom, which we've generously olive oiled, along with the sides of the pan, of course. And once that's prepped, we can set that aside and move on to this very, very simple batter. And for our dry ingredients, all we need is some all-purpose flour, to which we will add some salt, some baking powder, as well as its good friend baking soda. And then what we'll do is grab a whisk and give this a thorough mixing until we're fairly certain everything's been evenly combined, at which point we'll stop and move on to our wet ingredients. And that's going to start with 3 whole large eggs, to which we will add a tablespoon of honey, and any honey will work, but in case you're keeping score at home, I'm actually using a blackberry honey, which I just found out about, and it's a new thing in my life, but I'm really enjoying the relationship. And if you're thinking that little bit of honey does not seem like enough sweetness for an entire cake, well, it's not, which is why we're going to sneak in a little touch of sugar. And at this point, I will now distract you from the sugar quantity by adding a very generous amount of olive oil. And by the way, do yourself a favor and choose an olive oil that's kind of buttery and mild versus one that might have a much sharper, more bitter flavor. And these days usually says that right on the label. And then we will follow the oil with some freshly grated orange zest. Okay, a couple of tablespoons, which is probably going to take like 2 large oranges. And if you can, get the organic ones that don't have any of the wax on the surface. Because nobody, and I mean nobody, wants wax in their cake. And that's it, we will finish up with some cold fresh milk. That doesn't have to come from a cow, but that is the one I'm using. And that's it, we will simply whisk this until it's smooth, starting slowly at first, so as not to splash milk everywhere. And that's it, once that's mixed, we will finish our batter by stirring in our dry ingredients, which some say you should whisk in a little at a time, but I've never been a little at a time kind of guy. So I like to dump it all in at once, to make this a little more dangerous and thrilling. Plus I try to use a bowl that's a little too small, which also adds to the excitement. But anyway, if you start off slow, it should be fine. And when it starts to come together, we can be a little more aggressive. But at the same time, we don't want to overmix. So we are only going to whisk this until our batter is smooth and that flour just disappears, at which point we need to stop. And we will take that and transfer it into our prepared cake pan. And then as usual, whenever we transfer a batter into a pan like this, we always want to ask ourselves the question, should I tap that? And here the answer is yes. Okay, we definitely want to give this the old tappa, which will bring any of the larger bubbles up to the surface, which, by the way, would not really be a problem. But you know what? Give it a few taps anyway. And that's it. This is now ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about an hour, maybe a few minutes more, or until it looks like this, and a wooden skewer poked in the middle comes out clean. So I went ahead and tested mine, and it wasn't quite perfectly clean. So I was thinking this might be a few minutes undercooked, but that is usually not a problem, whereas overcooking this always is, and it might come out dry. So I decided it was fine, which means I need to let it cool for about 30 minutes before we try to remove it from the pan. And as it cools, that cake's going to deflate a little bit, or if it's slightly underbaked like mine was, it will deflate a little more than a little bit, especially in the center. But as you'll see, that ended up being not a problem. And I did not consider that a defect. I just thought of it as a perfect spot to put a few blackberries in. But anyway, I let that cool for 30 minutes, at which point I took a knife and went around the outside, to make sure our cake wasn't sticking to the pan. And then we'll place a plate on the top and flip it over. And besides snacking on a crumb, we'll go ahead and peel off that parchment. And then we can, if we want, leave it like this and decorate that flat side. But I'm going to go ahead and flip this back over, since as I already mentioned, I'm going to use that little depression to my advantage. And then what we'll do besides cleaning up any loose crumbs is let this finish cooling completely, right? Maybe another 20 or 30 minutes. At which point I'm going to dust over some powdered sugar, which we could just do straight to the top. But for a little extra fun effect, if we place our cooling rack on top and then sift the powdered sugar over, we're going to be left with this very cool, I think more interesting pattern. And if you're not into powdered sugar, you can simply serve this as is, or maybe glaze it with a simple icing. But any way you decide. I mean, you guys are after all this stuff in clays, of whether to glaze. But you know what? This powdered sugar design is fast and easy, and I think looks really nice. And then to finish up, I went ahead and added some blackberries to that depression in the center, which in the business we refer to as hiding the evidence. And then on top of that, we'll do a little bit of strategically placed orange zest. And then I don't know much about food styling or food photography, but I do know if you're going to take pictures of blackberries, you have to dust on a little bit of powdered sugar, which adds some contrast and makes for much better pictures. And after taking way too many of those, I grabbed a knife and cut out a nice big piece. And as I removed that and placed it on the plate, I was very happy to not see a bunch of raw batter. This was actually cooked very nicely. And that's it. I finished my plate with some fresh berries and a little more orange zest, as well as a nice big ladle of fresh blackberry sauce. And I believe we have several videos for several different fruit sauces, including berry. But really, any kind of fresh fruit, in either whole or sauce form, will work perfectly with this cake. And that's it. I grabbed a fork and dug in to what is a very simple, but I think outstanding cake. Okay, it might not be quite as light and tender as those other sponge cakes that require all those extra steps, but for me this is perfectly light enough. And as long as you don't overcook it and dry it out, I really do think everyone's going to be thrilled with the texture. And as far as the taste goes, using the olive oil versus the butter, if you didn't tell someone this was an olive oil cake, I really don't think many people would be able to tell the difference. Okay, on a practical level, fat is fat, so the olive oil does the same thing the butter would do. And any flavor of the olive oil, which of course is a little bit of acidity and bitterness, I think has been balanced perfectly with the sweetness, as well as of course that orange zest, which is never not a perfect pairing with olive oil. So we shouldn't really even be concerned with how easy this cake was, and we should just focus on how great it comes out, especially when you serve it with some kind of fresh fruit and or sauce. But anyway, that's it. My take on an Italian olive oil cake. I really truly think everyone will love this, except maybe unless you invited over a French cake maker. All right, they might have a couple issues, but that's okay. Italian desserts are just different. Okay, to me, French desserts are more about the actual dessert and the skills of the person making it, whereas an Italian dessert like this is just simply another sweet course to extend the meal, so we can have a little more wine and have time to laugh and tell more stories. And don't get me wrong, I love those fancy, fussy French desserts, but sometimes we just want something simple and basic that requires almost no effort. And to me, this is a perfect example of just that. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always,